Carlos Rafael Rivera, composer for The Queen's Gambit, which was written and directed by Scott Frank. And I understand that you guys met when you were his guitar teacher. So how did that evolve into you becoming his composer?
Man, it's surreal. It's surreal. I'm even talking to you right now, and I'm in this panel. For me, it's like the coolest thing because I read up that you kind of watched the Oscars when you were like 6 or something. I used to watch and record the Oscars on video cassette, and so I was a big
Oh,
fan of this, right?
yeah.
And so for me, it was like one of those things that I grew up in Central America thinking that composers and musicians were from another island or planet. Like I never thought I'd get to do this. And so as life started to happen, I moved to LA. I went to USC. I got my doctoral degree. I got in composition, and I started studying classical composition. And I had friends who were starting to do this thing, and I was like, oh, it's like a real thing. And making ends meet, I was teaching privately, and Scott Frank was my guitar student. He happened to be. I walked in. This is like 17 years ago, and I walked into his office in Pasadena, and I looked around, and he had a poster for like Minority Report. I was like, wow, that's Minority Report. And then he had another one for Dead Again. I was like, I love that movie. And then I just kept looking at the posters. I was like, what do you do? He goes, I'm a writer. I go, you wrote those? And he was like, yeah. I go, oh my God. I kind of freaked out. I went home and told my wife, and she's like, that's great, but you got to do the dishes. So that's basically, it went back to that. And we just started private lessons, and I was teaching him. And when he went to make his first movie, he hired James Newton Howard to do a movie called The Lookout. It's a good movie. And when I found out, it was like finding out that your friend's going out on a date. And so you're like vicariously going, so how'd it go? And what did you do? And that was the reality I was living. And because I knew my place, in his world, I was a guitar teacher. And so alongside that, I was getting my doctoral degree at USC. And I started, as I was studying composition, they had a mentorship program, and they paired me up with Randy Newman. And that was a fortuitous thing because Randy started inviting me over to sessions, and I'd start looking at how that worked, especially when Randy got a comment, and like from the directors, and they're like, "Oh, we don't like this thing," and he was like, "Yeah, yeah. Let me see if I can change that." And I was in the back of the room, of course, in the corner, going, "That's Randy Newman. You can't talk to Randy Newman like that. You can't tell him to change things." But being there was one of the most edifying things for me because I learned that we are a service industry. We serve the vision of whoever it is that we're working for. So that was very helpful. I have no idea if I answered your question.
Oh no, you did. That was a great bio, like a short bio recap of your relationship. So, but I talked to Stephen Meisler, the DP, a few months ago, and he said that you had some pieces written for Queen's Gambit before they started shooting, and that made it easier for him to like think of compositions for certain shots. So, when did you start writing pieces for the show?
In April of 2018, I got an email from Scott, and the subject said, the Queen's Gambit, and it said, this looks like the next thing we may be doing for Netflix. So of course I forwarded the email to my wife. I was like, yeah, and I downloaded the book and I read it like within a day and a half, and I started writing immediately because of the way I came into this sort of world. I didn't know what the process was. So as soon as I started working with Scott on a movie called The Welcome on the Tombstones, which was our first collaboration, I started making iMovies out of his screenplay. So I would like put in the script in an iMovie so you could read it, like if you're watching a film, but you're just reading words at a reading pace. And I started scoring those. And that was something that kind of evolved into the thing we call script movies. And as soon as I get anything from Scott, I start scoring the script. Plus, he's like one of the greatest writers of all time. Like the joke I always say is like, I love reading his emails because he's such a good writer. Anything he writes is great. And so I start writing, and the interesting thing is that it's an iterative process where you kind of begin to find it, look for that thing, which is the hardest part, is whatever the keyword is, tone, I guess, for a story, especially one like this one. And all the mistakes are made then, and so all the instrument choices that would have been wrong had you shown up a little later, you kind of save time by starting to find what it is. So that's a bit of an idea.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting that you start working without any footage and you just have the script. But all of
Yeah.
you guys had this task of making chess look exciting. So how did you look at your role in that assembly line of making it look cinematic and elevating the games with the music?
With terror. That's how I saw it. It was when I read the novel, I freaked out. First of all, Walter Tevis is a great storyteller, great novel, great story just on its own, and Scott did such an amazing adaptation of it. But when I read the games and the constant mentions of classical music, that's when I started getting scared, because I realized I was going to have to use, and the idea started there about using counterpoint or imitation in the writing, in the musical writing, because it's like a move and a counter move in the game. Well, you have a line and you have an imitation of the line, and you can vary it from there. And that felt like a way to go. But I was like, oh my God, we have to go. Like it had to be the choice, as opposed to coming up with something very different. And Scott gravitated to that as well. And Scott really did set the tone as well. He really wanted it to be piano. He wanted ideally an entirely piano based score for the whole show. But as Beth got out of the orphanage and her world started to grow, it started to feel like we needed to add instrumentation for it to kind of go along with her story arc. So
I kind of like how, especially in the beginning, like the music is like piano based, like you said, and it's kind of like pensive and cold and somber.
yeah.
But then like the scenes when she's playing the ceiling chess, it's bigger and like more lush, and it kind of all merges at the end in the final game versus Borgov, and has like the most instrumentation. So can you talk about like that approach to scoring those particular scenes differently?
Thank you for that question. It's the thing that happened, and mind you, the conversations I get to share with you and other music people is this is kind of like the nerd stuff. You don't really usually talk to the director about this. I didn't sit down with Scott and said, I have an idea that maybe, because if the idea sucked, he would just shoot it down and then the idea can't happen. So usually you kind of motivate yourself by coming up with different things. And one of the things that I saw was that she was doing something impossible. And the more impossible from reality a story is, the more music is usually needed to support it. And so as soon as we got to the ceiling, every time she'd play in the orphanage, yes, her reality was cold and it was piano and maybe some cello and stuff. But every time she looked at the ceiling, it was like, kind of like when you're a kid and you have a dream. You're like, one day I'm gonna grow up and be whatever. It's like a musical in your mind, and everything's fully realized, and it's gonna happen. And that sort of idea was the one I was trying to play to, because the only time you hear orchestral music in that is during the ceiling games. But as she grows and she develops as a character, her world, her reality starts to have more instruments being added, flutes and then winds. I mean, and then, eventually strings and brass, and it gets fuller. So by the time you get to the final episode and she arrives in the Soviet Union, her reality is the orchestral stuff that she kept seeing in the ceiling. And the piano now is part of the color, but it's not the main thing. So, but that's a story arc that really I get to tell you now, because had he not approved any of this stuff, you know what I mean?
It's
yeah,
just
it's
like,
not like
because you just coming together like in the game, it's the final game and she wins. So
yeah.
But the other thing I noticed was, some games like the timer is on and like you have like a score to it. So I guess, what was it like scoring those games when the timer is playing, or what was like the timer in the scenes at all? Like, do you have to like score to a different tempo when keeping in mind like the timer? Does that make sense?
By the way, I'm just blown away by your questions. It's ridiculous. This is actually another nerd moment thing. We really did. I've been very blessed to be able to collaborate with Wiley Stateman and Eric Hain, who also was part of that sound design team. Wiley Stateman, we call him Obi-Wan Kenobi, because if you look him up on IMDb, you'll see he's done most of the Tarantino sound design since Kill Bill, I think. And he is truly like an artist, unpretentious, just brilliant. And being able to collaborate with him on who takes over the scene, when does the sound of the timer, because you have to have that. It's important. It's part of the gameplay, and it adds a bit of tension. and being able to have moments even within a queue that you would say, should I take over or you take over? And being able to have that conversation on something so subtle as that was one of the great gifts for me. And every time he called me with some comment or some note, I'd be like, please share Obi-Wan, you know, because he is truly amazing at that. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a thing at the final game, and this you may have not noticed, but this is the kind of nerd stuff that I love in sound design is there's a moment when Beth looks up at the ceiling and we have our Marvel superhero kind of music moment, finally, like she's a superhero becoming. And then she looks down and she looks at Borgoff and she makes that first move where the chess piece, you know, moves. Listen for the sound design. It's impossible. You hear a whip. It's like, whoosh. Who does that? But Wiley's statement does it, and you're not aware of it. You're just so enthralled in it that it becomes part of this tapestry that is immersing you as an audience member into the story even deeper. And it's right in your face. It's just you don't notice it. And I love that. I'm a big fan of him, obviously.
Yeah. Well, finally, what is your chess game like?
You mean am I good at the game?
You have to pause and think about it. Yeah.
Oh, no.
So I take you don't play that much.
Oh no, I play on chess.com all the time. I've been playing since I started reading the novel, and I started playing to learn how to lose, and because that's sort of what I do well. And I kind of also realized that before, when I started playing chess, I knew I was bad. Now I know how bad I am,
Okay.
So that's sort of like my reality. Yeah, and I just play to entertain myself, like my wife plays Candy Crush. I just play, and I play minute games and minute blitzes and 3-minute games just because I can't have time for a long pensive sort of thing. But yeah, no, I love the game. I did fall in love with it. So,
well, Carlos, it was great speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you back in a little bit.
Thank you.